Okay, so pretty simple title, I guess, but not a simple subject. What is free will? So basically, the purpose of this talk is um, not so much to answer the question, do we have free will, as to make sure we're posing the right questions. Because free will is something that I think, as I stated in the abstract, everybody has an idea of, but I'm not sure that people are using the same definitions, and that can lead to confusion. So I'm going to talk about, you'll see that in the theme of the talk. So first of all, why do we care about free will? Well, there's two main reasons. One is we like to blame people, and we also like to take credit for our actions. So if we don't have free will, then basic concept of taking credit for your action or blaming somebody else. I guess it could be the reverse. You could blame yourself for your action and give credit to somebody else, but it usually doesn't work like that way. Um, is is in jeopardy, and then you also have we like to feel like we're in control of our own actions, and so that's another reason why free will is a very personal topic to people. Okay, so I wanted to know first what lay people think of free will, not what philosophers do. So I looked at the Urban Dictionary online, and it gave 5 definitions. Um, the ones in the middle I didn't choose because they were either restatements of these or ones I didn't like. But the first definition is the idea that you could have acted in a different way.
Yeah.
So it's a retroactive sort of definition. And the other one is that you are responsible for your actions. So I'll get into that a little bit later. But so first, if you restate the first definition, the ability to have acted differently in the exact same set of circumstances. So this, by its very nature, almost makes free will by definition a hypothetical, right? We don't observe things that could have happened or things that can happen. We observe things that do happen, and the actions we take are the actions we take. So, how do you measure something like that? So to take an example, this is just sort of a crazy example, but suppose I hypothesize that all cars and trucks and vehicles have an immortal spirit, and this spirit controls them, and it can choose to cause them to start the engine anytime it wants to, and behave anyway, even if there's no key in the ignition. But these spirits also have a very strong moral code, and they believe it's moral to behave in ways that are conformant with Newton's laws. So they have the ability to do crazy things, but they always choose not to. So this is a ridiculous example, but it shows that it's a fundamentally untestable hypothesis because it leads to the exact same conclusion that somebody would lead to if they just said, well, they're just machines. And so this is sometimes what you can hear philosophers talk about. One says, well, everybody's free to do something like, gouge their own eyes out and jump off a cliff, but they choose not to, and somebody else says, well, no, they can't. They're just obeying the laws of nature. And the 2 points of view lead to the same prediction, so, it's almost like semantics.
But you know that, right? This is a standard libertarian, that
Right.
philosophical term is libertarian sense of freedom.
Right, yeah.
You're going to choose to do the opposite.
Right, but we want to see if we can put it in some way that's at least, we can at least perform a thought experiment to determine whether or not it's true. Okay, so first of all, is free will equal to unpredictability? So we have 2 paradigms. Physics went through a change in paradigm with the quantum revolution, where Newtonian physics, that is pre-quantum, and I guess classical in this sense could also include relativity, just as long as we don't have quantum mechanics. So the future and the past is completely set by the state of the universe in the present. So if you were to have complete knowledge of every position and velocity of every particle in the universe at any given time, you can extrapolate to an unlimited degree as far in the past or future as you want to. Versus the orthodox view of quantum mechanics, which is that the outcome of measurements is undetermined and it's fundamentally random, even if we have all possible knowledge at the present. So the question is quantum uncertainty a doorway into free will? And I'm going to argue that no, I don't think it is. So first of all, so we can look at 3 different concepts. You have determinism, first of all, which I could state in the way that says everything that will ever happen has already been preordained by past circumstances, which, if you go back all the way to the beginning, it would be at the Big Bang. The state of things at the Big Bang would predict everything from the future, if it's were in a completely deterministic universe. You have indeterminism, which is that random events occur in a particular way for no reason at all. Nothing could have predicted why a certain event occurred the way it did, and if nothing can predict why a certain event can occur the way it did, then you cannot go back in retrospect and explain why it happened that way. So the inability to make a prediction of a future event also means that after it's happened, you cannot provide an explanation for why it happened that way. And then free will seems to be sort of a third concept that doesn't really fit neatly into either of them, which is that we are the cause of our own actions and that the sum of all external factors is insufficient to predict our behavior. If our behavior can be predicted entirely by what's external, then we don't have free will. But we want to also think of ourselves as rational agents. If we were just random, then, that's not ordinarily what we think of free will. We think we're following some rational laws. So it doesn't seem to fit really well into either determinism or indeterminism. Okay, so first of all, then one question is, what is external, right? Physical forces outside. Well, what about the physical forces in our body? Is that external to us or is that internal? And people can think of free will as being free from destiny or fate or divine influence or whatever. So I'll get to the external a little bit later. Okay, so then this is just a sort of possible graphs of where people might see free will as fitting in. Is it if you have on the one extreme end you have complete determinism, and on the one end you can imagine just complete randomness. Is free will somewhere in the middle where it's a combination of determinism and randomness? Or is it synonymous with randomness? If we're random, does that mean we're free? Or is it synonymous with determinism? Or is it a third object entirely? Is it something that doesn't fit on a scale? So that's different ways people might possibly see this. Okay, so why just one definition? So I'm going to propose two different definitions of free will that I think address at two different points. There was the point about being in control and the point about being able to blame somebody. So if we define spontaneous free will as the ability to behave either intentionally or unintentionally in such a way that no amount of knowledge could have anticipated our actions in advance. We can call that spontaneous free will because that means we have the ability to be spontaneous. Whereas blameworthy free will, I also could have called it praiseworthy free will, but it's more fun to blame people and praise them, so I called it blameworthy. So blameworthy free will is the ability to make moral or other important choices independently of deterministic causes, such as our genetics or fetal development that are beyond our control. Now,
that seems so academic. I mean, that's like
it's you're a little ahead. No, but this I don't think this is a coherent definition of blameworthy free will. This is sort of what I was trying to restate it in a way that would separate it from spontaneous free will, but also state it in a way that I think maybe some people in the general public would think about it.
But on the other hand, I think that's probably closer to reality, so I'm very interested.
Yeah,
that's probably true.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first I'll deal with a thought experiment. So first of all, here's a simple thought experiment I thought of, and now keep in mind, first of all, this is a philosophy thought experiment, not a physics thought experiment, so we can give ourselves a little more slack in terms of realisticness. But put somebody in a situation where they have to make a decision in a short period of time. Okay, so they don't have all day to contemplate it, and imagine they didn't know ahead of time that they had to make a choice. Let them make a decision, and then reset them and anything in their surroundings that's close enough to influence them to the exact same state it was before, and repeat. Now, if we were in a Newtonian universe, the exact same state would mean every particle is in the same position and velocity. We don't have to go that far. We can think about the exact same state as just meaning that anything around them would have the same likelihood of yielding a certain measurement. Like different particles that are in a certain quantum ensemble. Okay, so put them in the exact same. See if they make the same decision as before. Stressing that this is a short-term thing. So for spontaneous free will, make it a trivial decision, right? Maybe they find out that they have to go to work. They get a call. They didn't think they were working today. Their boss calls them and says, you know what? I need you to come into work in 5 minutes. They've got to get ready, get dressed. They need to pick out a tie, right? Simple decision where there's no prior commitments, but they have to make a decision. For blameworthy free will, make it a weighty decision. Imagine that they are walking by and they see somebody drowning, and if they save them, they might be late to work. Do they save the person's life or not? Or maybe they see a wad of $100 bills on a dashboard and there's no one around. Do they take it, or do they keep walking? Okay, so if we just take the extreme cases of either very trivial decisions or very important decisions, what do we end up with? Okay, for spontaneous free will, this is an ideal thought experiment, right? This is exactly what spontaneous free will is defined to answer. For blameworthy free will, it's not really a very good experiment, right? A person who's ethical would consistently make the ethical choice, whereas a sociopath would almost certainly make the selfish choice every time. In fact, the ability to predict somebody's actions based on their past behavior is something we all rely on, right? If we didn't have predictability in the moral sense, we wouldn't be able to form trusting relationships. You know, bosses wouldn't be able to promote their employees based on past performances. So we don't want to be spontaneous when it comes to moral choices. So I don't think spontaneous free will is really the free will anybody cares about.
That's right.
It's sort of a red herring. It's really blameworthy free will that we need to look at. And let's see, what do I have? And for that, this is not really a good thought experiment. It's interesting. One side note is to point out that if you are interested in spontaneous free will, if they make a different choice every time, that would definitely show it's true. But if they make the same decision every time, that doesn't necessarily disprove it, because you can imagine situations where somebody's brain maybe has a nonlinear response to the surroundings. So if you change situations slightly, they make a different decision, and that sort of gives somebody a semblance of unpredictability. So you can imagine there's more than one way we could be random. It could either be literal randomness, or it could be nonlinearity, like for instance with the weather. But that's just a side note. So now let's go into moral determinism, and I'm defining that to mean that, and this gets back to our definition of blameworthy free will. So it's a weaker condition than strict Newtonian determinism, but basically, if we think of moral determinism as the idea that given all relevant knowledge of somebody, meaning their brain development, genetic makeup, past experiences, it can be accurately predicted what their moral character will be in the various scenarios. So, for example, take two individuals who both experience the same amount of childhood abuse. One of them becomes an abuser himself or herself, the other becomes an activist against abuse. Now, so we're imagining now that the factor of life experiences we're setting equal. So we're taking that out of it as a variable. And we're just saying, okay, if we look at these people as infants or as unborn children, if we could have predicted this based on their genetics alone or based on their brain structure, does this make them less free?
I would say yes.
Well, I would say no, but that's what we're going to get at. Okay, so that's moral determinism. So moral determinism doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to predict what you order to drink or what tie I wear, but it means I'm going to be able to predict based on your genetics and your brain structure what your moral character will be in various scenarios. And of course, life experiences come into it, and no two people have the same life experiences, so this is a little bit of a hypothetical. But I still think it's a safe thought experiment to say you can put two people in with the same amount of abuse and see how they differ. So, is dualism to the rescue? Is dualism something that would save us, right? Dualism is the notion that human consciousness cannot be entirely reduced to material processes in the brain. If you are religious, it takes the form of a spirit or a soul, or it doesn't have to, or just a mind that's independent of your physical brain. But if somebody is worried about determinism because they think that the brain is just a collection of particles following the laws of physics, or because they think that brain structure and genetics entirely control our actions, then dualism may seem to be a way out. Now, and this gets back to what I said before about external versus internal factors. If you psychologically, if you believe in a soul, chances are that you may very well externalize your body and your brain as not being you, and your soul as being you. And if that's the case, dualism may make you feel more free, because it's really you making the decision if it's your soul versus if it's your brain, it's not. But if we forget about what's internal and external for us and just focus on causality, the causal nature of our actions, and just set aside the question of whether or not our brains are really us or something else, what do we end up with? Okay, imagine explaining one person's good behavior and someone else's bad behavior by a more or less moral soul or stronger spirit or whatever concept you think of that could make us more free. So, in other words, imagine you're somebody and you feel that genetic determinism makes us less free, or you feel that determinism based on brains that follow the laws of physics make us less free. Now you can choose a definition, or you can choose an explanation you want to. What explanation would you choose that would make you feel more free if you had a choice? And dualism is something that a lot of people would choose. But is one person's moral soul the result of a choice they made in the past? No, this would lead to a logical circle. You can't say that I chose to be a moral soul because I'm a moral soul. That's circular reasoning. Is it random? You know, did somebody just get a moral soul at birth because the forces of nature or God decided to make them moral? Well, this is sort of being dealt a moral or immoral soul is sort of like being dealt a bad set of genes. The outcome is the same. It's not in your control. And if you think about that, that almost has to be true by definition, because if we're invoking this soul or this spirit to explain choice, and our explanation of choice is itself the result of a choice we made, that's inherently circular. Now, instead of genetic determinism, we have ectoplasmic determinism or soul stuff determinism. Presumably, a soul would have to follow some laws of rationality, just as a brain follows the laws of physics. And this is a quote from Sam Harris here that says, "Even if you believe that every human harbors an immortal soul, the picture does not change. Anyone born with the soul of a psychopath has been profoundly unlucky." And that's his emphasis, not mine. So it's true that if our brain, if you imagine that we don't have dualism, if we're just purely brains that are obeying the laws of nature, well, it's true that the laws of physics are at their core simple. Complex structures can have qualities and properties that their parts don't have. So even if the brain is ultimately obeying the laws of physics, it's a complex structure, and you can't just reduce it to physical equations. It's too complicated. And as I've stated here, a soul would have to also follow some laws of rationality. A soul that obeys laws of rationality versus a brain that's very complex and follows the laws of physics but in an extremely complex way seems to have the same effect. So I don't think dualism is really the answer to free will. And here is a square circle. So basically, there's no such thing as a square circle.
So it does exist.
Right.
Now we see.
This is my failed attempt at a square circle. It's just a circle superimposed on a square. So the reason I put this here is because my point of view is basically if free will is not logically coherent, then it's not really accurate to say we lack free will. If somebody says we don't have free will, my attitude is put the burden of proof on them to define to come up with a definition of free will that's logically coherent, and then show that we lack it. Otherwise, saying we lack free will is kind of like saying we lack the ability to draw a square circle. My inability to make a square circle is not a limitation of ability on my part. It's just the fact that a square circle is logically an incoherent concept. And I hope to have shown that definitions of free will that people often use are not logically coherent. Now, let's see. So does this mean we lack free will? Maybe not. So compatibilism is the concept that in philosophy that free will is compatible with determinism. The opposite view would be incompatibilism, and this takes two forms. There is either hard determinism, which is incompatible with determinism, or libertarianism, which is not related to the political philosophy at all. And really the only way you can have a logically coherent defense of free will is to be a compatibilist. Libertarianism, certainly in my view, is not logically coherent. And if we go back to, let's see, all the way back here, okay. So what libertarians essentially have to try and do is they have to try and insert different points of randomness into our decision process. And I'm claiming no combination of randomness and determinism is going to give you a third category of free will. Notice that in my thought experiment, I made two assertions. First of all, I made sure this was a short-term decision. And the second thing I made sure of is that I only looked at extreme cases, either a trivial case or a very important case. Now, in real life, decisions we make are not always short-term. They're over a long period of time. We contemplate them. As we're contemplating a decision, there's other decisions we make in the process. We interact with the universe around us.
This is why I don't like libertarianism, because
Right.
they're always operating in a vacuum. They always say that there
Right.
is a point where you are like you have the God ability to look upon, and you're unbounded by any previous
Right.
past, any influences. In other words, motives.
Mm-hmm.
We punish people for motives, not what they could have otherwise done. No.
Right. Yeah.
So essentially, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, that's fine. So basically, if you look at it in those terms, then a series of deterministic choices and random choices put together can give the illusion of a third category. But as you get right down to it, any choice you make is either going to be random, in which case it's not really a choice, it's just by definition it's a random process, or it's a choice you made, in which case it has to have been determined by something about your character, whether you think it's because of your brain structure from the laws of physics, the nature of your soul. It's deterministic either way. So this is why I think libertarianism is not even a logically coherent option. You're either a compatibilist or you're a hard determinist. Okay, so now let's get back to where we were. Okay, so this is, I think, our last slide. All right, now here, this is a quote from the Bible, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31. I'm not going to read it out loud, but basically, this quote is interesting because Moses is conveying a message to the Israelites from God, and basically what he's saying is, you guys they've already been disobedient, but he's talking about how he's going to punish them for future disobedience. So the disobedience they've already displayed, they're not going to be punished for, but he's basically saying, I know in advance, in the future at some point, you guys are going to break these rules. I'm telling you what your punishment is going to be for your future crime, essentially. If this sounds contradictory, it's almost certainly intentionally contradictory on the part of the author or authors of the books. And so the God of the Old Testament, and in fact the God of the Bible in general, whether you believe in his existence or not, has certainly influenced Western thinking, and he can be seen as sort of the ultimate compatibilist, right? He knows everything everybody's going to do in advance because he's God, yet one of the underpinnings of his character is that he's intent on holding people accountable for their actions. So he's sort of the personification of compatibilism, if you will. So compatibilism is not a new concept.
Very good point.
Yeah. So now I want to shift gears a little bit. So far, our attempts at defining free will haven't been very successful. So maybe physics is not the right place to look. In fact, I don't think physics is really the right place to look for free will. If there's anything that can lead you to free will, it's in biology and in particular neuroscience. Chris Frith is a neuroscientist, and he said, is it possible to predict people's actions on the basis of their neural activity that precedes their decisions? If so, free will is an illusion. So this is sort of another contender for a definition of free will. Are we aware of our actions? Or at least it would seem to some people that awareness is, if not sufficient for free will, at least necessary. This is an assumption they're making. Now here is an abstract, most of an abstract. I couldn't fit it all on one screen, so there's ellipses. But basically, in Nature Neuroscience, J.D. Haynes and other experimenters performed an experiment, and I couldn't really give a diagram for this experiment. I'll just have to explain it in words, but it's really interesting what they did. Yeah. So they had these test subjects, and and this has been repeated several times. But they had some machine, like an MRI or some other probes, monitoring their brain. And the test subjects had a lever or button or something, and basically they were given a task. They said, don't plan anything out in advance. Just move the lever one way or the other, left or right. And don't plan out which direction you're going to move it in. Don't plan when you're going to move it. Just as soon as you get the urge to move it one way or the other, just do it. And then the subjects had to record when they made the choice to move the lever, and also, which would also be synonymous with the time in which they chose to move it left or right. And the way they measured that was there was a screen, and it was giving letters at random in random order. Right? It wasn't A, B, C. It was just different letters, and each letter would appear on the screen for about a half second. And so they would be asked to record or explain what letter was appeared on the screen when they made the decision. So the researchers had accuracy to within a half of a second as to when the test subjects actually made the conscious decision. So what they found is that up to, in some cases, 10 seconds before their decision, there was brain activity that told the researchers when, either when or at least what decision they were going to make. Now there have been other experiments that have dealt with this type of thing, but I believe this was the first one that had this long of a time. There have been experiments that have measured within the order of milliseconds between brain activity and actual motor awareness of motor skills, but this is significant in that 10 seconds is a lot longer than a few milliseconds. So that's really what makes this more significant to the issue of free will than, a matter of milliseconds.
Do you know the actual signal that they detect? And does it actually tell them if they're going to go left, right, or is it just something flashes and they...
It's certain brain activity in a hemisphere, and I believe from the article, it's not a given signal. It's something they have to interpret retroactively. So in other words, they can say, okay, here's this person here. When this guy has this brain activity, it precedes his making a decision in one direction or another. So it might not be exactly the same activity from one individual to the next.
I think his point is, let's say I do left, and you record a signal left. The one that's going through the brain, does it actually say some activity, or does it actually say, well, he decided to activate his, let's say, left his right brain. Something happens in the right brain that precludes us to say, you might be able to predict his decisions from the brain signal, not by the visual observation. I think that's one.
Yes, that's right. Machine predicted before.
Before your physical.
They were not able to predict in real time before the person made the decision. The only way they were able to do it is retroactively by looking at it and then saying, okay, this is the pattern we observed with this individual. But it's as far as I'm aware, this is in 2008, so they may have improved things since then. But as far as I'm aware, they don't have the ability with a machine to predict in real time, 10 seconds ahead of time, what someone's going to do. It's just something where you look at the pattern afterwards and then make a deduction.
But even this is very important.
Yeah, even that's very important.
But from that pattern, is it just that they predict that a decision has been made, or a decision has been made to move left?
Oh, a decision to move left or right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so arguments for, these are a couple of quotes from people who try to reconcile free will with this. The problem can be solved as long as you do not think of free will as a momentary act. Once we understand that deliberation and decision are processes that spread out over time, then there is plenty of room for conscious components. And then Dan Dennett, the philosopher, said, such a question betrays a deep confusion, for it presupposes that what you are, his emphasis, is something else in addition to all this brain and body activity. What you are just is this organization of all the activity that your body has developed. You automatically know about these things going on in your body because if you didn't, it wouldn't be your body. Now this goes a little bit too far in turning it into tautology, but because he extends things to the body, not just the brain. And then arguments against, both by Sam Harris. So where is the freedom in doing what wants when one's desires are the products of prior events that one has completely unaware of and had no hand in creating? And then also, the second quote is more of a direct response to Dennett's, I believe. He says, to say that you are responsible or identical to everything that goes on in your brain and body is to make a claim about you that bears no relationship to the experience of consciousness, authorship, and subjectivity that has made free will a problem for philosophy in the first place. Okay, so there's different views about whether or not awareness is a necessary condition for free will. So I just have a number of questions. First of all, if we hold that awareness is a necessary condition for free will, that unconscious choices are not really choices, how do we deal with self-deception? There's people who can convince themselves of something and they can lie to themselves about the reason that they're doing things, like somebody who doesn't believe climate change is real, but even though there's all this evidence it is, because they want to be able to work at their factory job at the fossil fuel plant and, vote for the people they like and listen to the people they like on the radio and not lose sleep. So they convince themselves that climate change is fake and, they could take a lie detector and it would show up. So people can deceive themselves. Does that make them less responsible for their actions? Well, personally, I would say no. What about other tells people have? And this sort of gets to I think the question you were getting at. Suppose, for instance, somebody wakes up in the morning and you look at their brain chemistry, and by looking at their brain chemistry in the morning, you can predict with, say, maybe not 100%, but 99% or 90% accuracy whether or not they're going to get into an argument with their spouse, right? Does this mean it's not a free choice? And then there's a question of, is there even a clear divide between conscious and unconscious? Or there might be things that are somewhere in between. Another point is, it's been pointed out that all of our thoughts ultimately come from unconscious activity. Is it logically possible to imagine our thoughts not coming from unconscious, being preceded by unconscious activity? If every conscious thought we had was a result of another conscious thought, and you imagine that we were aware of all our own future decisions, in a sense that makes us less free. In fact, I don't have a quote for this because this was just something that some guy on YouTube said a while ago, but he was talking about God, and one of the arguments he gave against the existence of God is, he said, if God is really all-knowing, he knows all his future decisions. If he knows all his future decisions, how can he be free? Now, this is not a talk about God's existence, but point is that I'm just raising the question that, in a sense, is ignorance of our own future decisions something that's necessary for us to be free? If we knew what they were, we would be less free, in a sense. So I'm not entirely convinced that awareness is necessary for us to be free.
So your conclusion is, what you're saying is, we don't necessarily need awareness to be free.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is what Daniel Dennett is saying.
Right, I see things very similar to the way he sees things, actually. Yeah.
Can I
Sure.
give you an example that supports your conclusion?
Sure, go ahead.
Maybe later, if you want to
Well-
ask a short question, then now. But the discussion, let's postpone after the talk.
I agree, Alexei, we'll wait.
Okay, so does this mean we're at another
Just
square
remember,
circle?
sure.
So the first definition of free will we looked at from determinism versus randomness and a soul was essentially a square circle. Have we arrived at another square circle? That's my question. And so just in closing, I'm going to propose, I'm not saying this is the best we can do, but it's something we at least need. I've called poor man's free will, because it's not the type of free will that necessarily people mean, but I think this is a type of free will that we at least need to have if we're going to maintain a system of law and ethics. So can we make a qualitative distinction between brain conditions that are caused by an illness, like say for instance a brain tumor, and ordinary brain varieties? One possible distinction could come from the question of whether or not it would be ethical to cure a brain condition like selfishness or short-sightedness. Now this comes from the fact that the neuroscientist Sam Harris has made the point that a brain tumor is just a special case of all determinism, right? If somebody is acting erratically because of their brain tumor, they're not responsible for that, but ultimately everything is a result of brain activity. Therefore, if you're going to make the exception for someone with a brain tumor, logically you have to also make an exception for everybody based on their brain chemistry. So my claim is, at least in practice, we have to be able to make a distinction between those two things. And another thing that Harris brought up was, he said, imagine we can cure evil. If we had a pill that would stop people from being evil, would we then give that to people instead of punishing them? My response to that would be, would it really be ethical to cure evil? What if I found a cure for anybody who disagreed with me? All my political views are correct. If you disagree with me, there must be something wrong with your brain, so I'm going to make a pill and give it to you. So we can make a distinction between, even if they're both materialistic states of brain, we can make a distinction between states that just come about from natural variation, which we can put in the realm of free will, or at least poor man's free will, versus something that's clearly a malignant tumor or an injury or something else, or an illness. And one measure for that is, would it be ethical for us to cure this if we could? So that's what I'll conclude with. So basically, I think it might be possible to do better than poor man's free will. I'm not entirely sure that this square circle is a square circle. But at the current time, I don't know. I'll have to do, there's still a lot more research to do on this, actually. But I think poor man's free will is at least a good place to start, at least to preserve our sense of responsibility in a practical, legal sense. Okay, so, and then I almost didn't include this slide because I didn't want to detract from the discussion on things I've already said. But I just thought these might be possible future talks, which could be given not necessarily by me, but by anybody, that relate to free will. And one is, could genetic engineering destroy the public's trust in free will? If we began to be able to engineer people to have certain traits, would that make people feel less free, and would that somehow affect our system of justice? And then the other thing is, which is an entirely different topic, would lack of free will invalidate the justification for retribution on people?
This has been argued for centuries. That's like a wrong question.
I agree.
Absolutely wrong. I don't have time for this. Yeah.
No, but well, somebody else may find it. So that's I think the last slide. So that's all I have. So
Many thanks.
well, yeah.
Good job.